Most people think massive action comes from motivation, but the real psychological secret runs much deeper than a quick burst of energy. It begins with something your brain does automatically, long before you consciously decide to take action. It happens in that tiny moment when you imagine a future version of yourself succeeding or failing, and your mind quietly decides which outcome feels more emotionally powerful. This inner visualization, this mental image loaded with emotion, is the hidden driver that forces you into motion. When that image is vivid, urgent, and emotionally charged, your brain treats it like a real event that's about to happen. That's why athletes rehearse success in their minds before ever stepping onto the field. What people don't realize is that the moment you mentally see and feel yourself taking action, your brain begins rewriting your identity. You stop thinking, "I should do this," and you begin thinking, "This is who I am now." And once identity shifts, action becomes automatic. There is no resistance, no hesitation, no bargaining. The internal story pulls you forward like gravity. But most people only activate this psychological mechanism by accident, or worse, they visualize the opposite: failure, embarrassment, judgment, and that becomes the story their brain commits to. The instant you flip that image, the instant you associate action with pride, momentum, and personal evolution, your behavior changes faster than motivation ever could. This shift is not about hype. It's about rewiring the emotional meaning behind the first step, because the moment the emotional meaning changes, everything else follows. What makes this psychological secret so powerful is that the brain is constantly trying to avoid emotional pain and seek emotional reward, and it doesn't care whether the threat or reward is real. It only cares about the intensity of the image. Meaning, if the picture of your future self failing is more emotionally vivid than your picture of succeeding, you will freeze. But if the opposite becomes true, if the image of taking action becomes emotionally irresistible, your brain pushes you into motion instantly, without waiting for confidence, clarity, or the perfect timing. This is why people who hit rock bottom suddenly transform their lives. The fear of staying the same becomes more painful than the fear of change. The emotional scales flip, and action becomes the path of least resistance. Most people never intentionally flip those emotional scales, so they stay stuck in hesitation mode, waiting for a motivational spark that never lasts. But the real secret is that action doesn't come from motivation, it comes from emotional imbalance. It comes from tipping the internal scale so dramatically that not acting feels unbearable. When you create a mental picture of your future self that is so compelling, so meaningful, and so emotionally charged that staying the same feels like self-betrayal, your brain will no longer allow you to delay. It will force you into the next step, even if you're scared, even if you doubt yourself. Because in that moment, identity shifts first, action follows second, and confidence grows third, not the other way around. This psychological trigger is what the most successful entrepreneurs, athletes, creators, and leaders use, whether they know it consciously or not. They attach so much emotional weight to a certain behavior that it becomes impossible not to act. Think about someone training for a marathon. They aren't motivated every day. What moves them is the psychological image of crossing the finish line, the pride of overcoming self-doubt, the identity of becoming someone who follows through. The emotional story becomes stronger than the discomfort. When that story becomes part of your identity, procrastination loses its power. You begin acting automatically because acting feels consistent with who you are. And the stronger that identity becomes, the more momentum builds. This is why some people make changes that seem impossible, losing weight after years of struggle, building a business from nothing, breaking toxic habits. Once they emotionally attach to a new identity, their behavior changes to match it. They no longer wake up asking, "Will I do this today?" Instead, the question becomes irrelevant. They act because that's who they are now. And the secret underneath all of this is that identity is not fixed. It is chosen, reinforced, and emotionally conditioned. The moment the emotional reward of becoming your future self outweighs the emotional comfort of staying the same, the shift becomes permanent. But here is where the secret becomes even more interesting. Your brain is not motivated by logic, only by the feelings attached to the logic. You can logically know you should start a business, study, work out, quit a bad habit, or improve your life. But if the emotional weight behind that decision is weak, nothing will change. This is why people set goals every January and abandon them by February. The goals are logical, but the emotional anchors are loose. The psychological secret is to make the emotional experience of action more powerful than the emotional comfort of inaction. And the fastest way to do this is to connect action with identity, urgency, and pride. When you imagine yourself a year from now, looking back and feeling proud of who you became, that emotion becomes fuel. When you imagine looking back and feeling regret because you didn't act, that emotion becomes pressure. Your brain takes both images seriously. It begins treating them like predictions rather than possibilities. And once that emotional clarity is in place, every step forward feels natural because each action reinforces a story you already believe. The key is not to push yourself into action, but to build an identity so emotionally convincing that action becomes the default pathway. Another part of this psychological secret is something behavioral scientists call micro-commitment identity loops. Every tiny action you take becomes proof of who you are becoming, and that proof feeds the emotional momentum behind the next action. For example, if you wake up early once, your brain barely notices. But if you pair that action with a strong emotional message, "This is who I am becoming. This is the version of me I choose," your brain stores it as identity evidence. Do it twice and the story strengthens. Do it 3 times and hesitation begins to die. Most people think transformation requires huge steps, but the brain does not measure size, it measures identity consistency. When your actions consistently align with your chosen identity, the psychological resistance fades away. Suddenly, difficult tasks feel easier. Habits lock in faster. Decision-making becomes clearer. And because you no longer feel like you're forcing yourself, motivation becomes irrelevant. You move because not moving feels out of character. This loop of microactions shaping identity and identity shaping more actions is the hidden engine behind all massive change. Now imagine applying this secret to your biggest goal right now. Instead of telling yourself you should do something, you create a vivid emotional image of the future version of you who has already done it. You picture the pride, the confidence, the impact. You feel it. And then you amplify that image until it becomes more emotionally real than the fear or discomfort you feel today. At that moment, your brain adopts that future version of you as the identity it wants to protect. And when your brain believes action is necessary to protect your identity, it becomes impossible not to take action. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop delaying. You stop waiting for the perfect time. Your actions become instant because your brain is emotionally invested in becoming that future version. This is the same mechanism behind people who suddenly change their lives after a powerful event, a breakup, a failure, a loss, a breakthrough. The emotional intensity makes the new identity undeniable. But you don't have to wait for a dramatic moment. You can create your own psychological trigger by amplifying the emotional meaning behind your next step. This psychological secret also explains why willpower fails. Willpower is a limited resource, easily drained by stress, decisions, or distractions. But identity-based action does not depend on willpower at all. Once you emotionally associate yourself with a specific future version, your daily choices become automatic. A person who sees themselves as an athlete does not negotiate about training. A person who sees themselves as a creator does not negotiate about producing. A person who sees themselves as disciplined does not negotiate about routine. The identity removes the negotiation. And removing negotiation is what produces massive action instantly. Because the biggest enemy of action is not fear, it is negotiation. The internal debate is where progress dies. But when identity takes over, there is no debate left. There is only alignment. Every action you take becomes a statement to yourself, "This is who I am." And the more often you repeat that, the more unstoppable you become. In the end, this psychological secret is not magic. It is a shift in the emotional architecture of your mind. You take control of the internal movie playing in your imagination. You choose the future version of yourself you want your brain to prioritize. You intensify the emotional meaning until the cost of staying the same becomes heavier than the discomfort of change. And once that balance tilts, Action becomes instant, natural, and consistent. You no longer chase motivation, you create emotional alignment. You no longer wait for courage, you generate identity. You no longer fear failure, you fear the feeling of not becoming who you were meant to be. And that fear, that emotional clarity, that powerful internal image becomes the engine that drives massive action every single day. When you master this psychological shift, your life stops being controlled by hesitation and becomes powered by identity. And once your identity changes, your future changes with it, instantly, permanently, and overwhelmingly in your favor.